There is a particular kind of silence that settles over an athlete who knows something the crowd doesn't. Not the silence of doubt, not the silence of fear, the silence of someone who has already processed a truth that everyone around them is still weeks away from understanding. Caitlyn Clark carried that silence through the final stretch of her Indiana tenure with a composure that, in retrospect, says more about her character than almost anything she produced on the court. She showed up. She competed. She gave Indiana everything the game required. And somewhere underneath all of it, she already knew this chapter had an ending date stamped on it by people whose names never appear on a roster. The fans who packed those arenas did not know they were attending a farewell. That is perhaps the most quietly devastating detail of this entire story. They came because she made them believe Indiana was the center of something historic, and in many ways it was. What they could not have known was that the institutions surrounding her had already begun architecting what came next in rooms they would never be invited into, with a timeline that had nothing to do with wins, losses, or the deafening noise of a fan base that built itself around her almost overnight. If you believe that sports are only about what happens on the floor, this story will unsettle you. It should. If this kind of storytelling feels different from what you usually find that is intentional, subscribe, and we will keep building it together. Ames, Iowa, is not a city that produces mythology. It is a city that produces work. Flat, honest, unromantic work. The kind that doesn't care whether anyone is watching and doesn't change its standards based on who shows up to evaluate it. Caitlyn Clark grew up inside that value system, and it shaped something in her that no coaching staff, no league office, and no market relocation can touch. She was not built for approval. She was built for excellence, which is an entirely different thing. The distinction matters more than most people realize, because players built for approval adjust themselves to fit the room. Players built for excellence make the room adjust to them. Clark, from her earliest years of organized basketball, was always the second kind. What Iowa gave her was not just a work ethic that framing is too simple and too familiar. What it gave her was a specific relationship with pressure. In smaller markets, in quieter gyms, in programs that don't receive the automatic recruiting pipelines of coastal powerhouses, you learn something essential, that the only currency that actually holds its value is performance, not perception, not narrative, not the goodwill of people in positions above you, just the work and what it produces when the moment arrives. Clark internalized that completely. It became the foundation of a competitive identity so self-contained and so deeply rooted that even when the institutions around her began moving in directions she hadn't chosen, she never lost her footing. Iowa made sure of that long before Indiana ever entered the conversation. When a franchise receives a generational talent, it faces a choice that most franchises are never honest enough with themselves to properly identify. The choice is not how to use the player. The choice is whether the organization is willing to transform itself at the same speed the player is transforming everything around it. The Indiana Fever, by every observable measure, were not prepared for the velocity of what Caitlyn Clark's arrival actually meant. She did not arrive as a star, joining an existing ecosystem. She arrived as a new ecosystem entirely, one that brought its own audience, its own cultural energy, its own commercial architecture, and its own set of expectations that had nothing to do with what the Fever had been before she walked through the door. That gap between what she represented and what the organization was structurally capable of meeting became the quiet fault line running beneath an otherwise extraordinary season. The details that emerged were not dramatic in isolation. Confusing in-arena messaging, a fan experience that felt disconnected from the audience Clark had actually attracted, an organizational identity that hadn't yet decided what it wanted to be in the presence of someone who had already decided exactly what she was. None of these things individually would sink a franchise, but collectively, they revealed something important. Indiana inherited a phenomenon and responded with the infrastructure of a mid-tier regional operation. The fans Clark brought to that building were new to women's basketball, passionate, commercially valuable, and paying close attention. What they found when they arrived told them something about the organization's priorities, and eventually, it told the league something too. There is a version of Caitlyn Clark that the highlight packages capture perfectly. The deep threes, the no-look passes, the range that made opposing coaches visibly recalibrate their defensive schemes in real time. That version is real, and it is remarkable. But it is also the surface layer of something considerably more complex operating underneath. What Clark was doing tactically throughout her Indiana tenure was not simply scoring at a high level in a new league. She was systematically expanding the conceptual boundaries of what a point guard in women's basketball was understood to be capable of. Every shot she took from ranges that had previously been considered irresponsible was a deliberate argument. Every pass she threaded into collapsing defenses was a demonstration of spatial intelligence that forced the entire league to respond, not just the team she was playing against on a given night. The less visible dimension of her game, the one that statistics only partially reflect, was her understanding of attention. Clark grasped early that her presence on the floor changed the geometry of every possession, whether she touched the ball or not. Defenses allocated resources to her that freed teammates in ways that required those teammates to be ready for opportunities they had rarely seen at this frequency before. Managing that dynamic, knowing when to dominate and when to redistribute, when to take the shot that breaks a defense psychologically, and when to let the created space do the work quietly, that is a form of basketball intelligence that develops slowly in most players. In Clark, it arrived almost fully formed. Indiana benefited from it enormously. Whether the organization ever fully understood what it was witnessing is a different question entirely. Sold-out arenas have a way of obscuring organizational dysfunction. The noise covers it, the revenue softens it. The national attention reframes it as success, even when the internal architecture is quietly coming apart at the seams. For a period, Indiana's sellouts did exactly that. They made it easy to look at the fever and see a franchise ascending when a more honest assessment would have identified an organization struggling to build systems capable of sustaining what Clark had created almost unilaterally. The disconnect was not between Clark and her teammates. It was structural. It lived in the decision-making layers above the court, in the gap between what the moment demanded institutionally and what the organization was actually delivering. And gaps like that, in professional sports, do not stay invisible forever. They surface. They always surface. What made Indiana's situation particularly significant was the nature of the audience Clark had attracted. These were not casual observers who would forgive an inconsistent experience and return anyway out of habit. They were new converts, people who had come to women's basketball specifically because of her, people whose loyalty was real, but whose patience with an organization that seemed uncertain of its own identity was understandably limited. When that audience began sending signals through attendance patterns, through social media, through the very specific language fans use when they feel an organization is not matching the energy of its own star, those signals were data. The league read that data carefully, and what it told them shaped decisions that Indiana's front office may not have fully anticipated until it was too late to alter the outcome. What do you think an organization owes a player who builds something from nothing on their behalf, and what happens when that debt goes unacknowledged? Leave your thoughts below. The version of Caitlyn Clark that sold out arenas was built in the hours when no arena existed to fill. Early mornings in empty gyms, late evenings when the coaching staff had gone home and the only audience was the ball and the floor and the specific kind of honest feedback that solitary repetition provides. This is not a romantic notion. It is a mechanical reality of how elite athletes at her level actually develop. The range that looked effortless in game situations was the product of thousands of repetitions taken from distances that felt unreasonable until they didn't. The court vision that made her passing look instinctive was actually a trained perceptual skill, built through deliberate study of defensive tendencies, of how pressure shifts when the ball moves, of where space opens a half second before most players recognize it is there. None of that arrives as a gift. All of it is constructed painstakingly in the quiet. What separates Clark's preparation culture from that of merely talented players is not the volume of work plenty of athletes put in extraordinary hours. It is the intentionality behind each session. There is a quality of attention that elite performers bring to practice that transforms repetition from habit into refinement. Every shot is information. Every defensive reaction is data. Every drill is a conversation between the player and the specific weakness she is trying to eliminate. Clark approached her development with that precision from an early age, which is why her growth curve looked so steep to outside observers. It was not steep. It was simply the visible result of invisible work that had been accumulating long before anyone outside Iowa was paying attention. Every athlete's career is shaped by two categories of people: those who understood what they were looking at early enough to matter, and those who recognized it only after the evidence became impossible to ignore. For Clark, the first category includes coaches and mentors who encountered her before the national spotlight arrived and made decisions based on what they observed rather than what the consensus said she was. Lynn Dunn, the former Purdue and Indiana Fever coach whose career spans 9 decades of women's basketball, represents something specific in this story. Her connection to Clark is not incidental. It is the connection of someone who has spent a lifetime identifying the difference between players who are talented and players who are transformative, and who recognized immediately which category Clark occupied. That recognition, and the relationships built around it, became part of the infrastructure of Clark's career in ways that extended well beyond the court. The second category, those who were slower to see it clearly, is more complicated to discuss honestly. It is not populated by villains. It is populated by people inside an organization who were handed something unprecedented and responded with the tools and frameworks they already possessed, which were built for a different scale of challenge entirely. The Indiana front office did not fail Clark out of malice. They failed her out of institutional limitation, which in some ways is harder to fix because it cannot be addressed simply by changing intentions. It requires changing structures, hiring differently, thinking at a scope the organization had never previously been required to operate at. That kind of transformation takes time, and time, as it turned out, was the one resource Indiana did not have enough of. Statistics in women's basketball have a translation problem. The raw numbers exist. They are tracked and reported and debated. But the contextual layer that makes those numbers meaningful is still being built in real time as the league grows into its own analytical infrastructure. Which means that what Clark produced statistically during her Indiana tenure was simultaneously visible and underread. The points were counted, the assists were logged, the shooting percentages were debated. But the secondary effects, the defensive rotations she forced that opened driving lanes for teammates, the offensive possessions opposing coaches designed entirely around containing her that inadvertently simplified the game for everyone else on the floor, the attendance figures and broadcast numbers that moved in direct correlation with her presence in a market, those dimensions of her impact lived outside the box score entirely, and they told a more complete story than any single stat line could. What the numbers did capture, clearly and without ambiguity, was the pace at which she was developing relative to where most players are at the same stage of their professional careers. The growth curve between her earliest WNBA appearances and her most recent performances was not the gradual incremental improvement typical of a young player adjusting to a new level of competition. It was accelerated, deliberate, and pointed in a very specific direction. She was not simply becoming more comfortable. She was becoming more precise, more selective, more tactically complete. The game was slowing down for her in the way it only slows down for players who have done the internal work required to process it at a fundamentally different speed than their peers. Indiana was watching something compound. The question the numbers quietly raised was whether the organization around her was compounding at anywhere near the same rate. There is something that happens in a building when a player of genuine consequence steps onto the floor that no attendance figure, no revenue report, and no broadcast rating fully captures. It is a quality of attention, a collective leaning forward, a shared understanding among thousands of people who arrived as individuals that they are witnessing something that will not be available to them indefinitely. Indiana experienced that feeling consistently during Clark's tenure, and the people inside those arenas understood it even if they could not have articulated precisely what was producing it. What they were responding to was not just skill. Skill alone does not generate that quality of attention. What they were responding to was a player who carried the weight of the moment visibly, who did not diminish under pressure but expanded into it, who made the largest stages feel like the environment she had been calibrated for, rather than a test she was hoping to survive. That quality, the ability to make consequence feel like home, is perhaps the least measurable and most significant thing Clark brought to Indiana. It changed what women's basketball felt like to attend in that market. It changed what it felt like to watch on television. It changed the conversations happening in offices and living rooms and school gyms across the Midwest among people who had never previously scheduled their evenings around a WNBA game. Legacy is a word that gets applied too quickly and too broadly in sports. But what Clark built in Indiana in a compressed and extraordinary period of time was genuinely foundational, not for her own career, which has many chapters remaining, but for the sport itself, and for the specific argument that women's basketball at its highest level deserves the same quality of attention that any great game demands. She did not make that argument with words. She made it every single night she stepped onto that floor. Los Angeles will receive Caitlyn Clark with the full apparatus of the largest media market in the country. The cameras, the celebrity culture, the commercial infrastructure that turns accomplished athletes into global brands. All of it will be available to her in a way that Indiana, by geography and by scale, simply could not provide. And there is a version of this story where that transition works exactly as the people who engineered it intended, where the platform expands her reach exponentially, where the visibility generates commercial partnerships and broadcast audiences that redefine what the WNBA's ceiling looks like, where Los Angeles becomes the stage that Indiana was always too small to be. That version is plausible. The logic behind it is not without merit. Large markets do amplify certain kinds of stars in ways that smaller markets structurally cannot. And the people who made this decision are not operating without precedent or without data. But there is another version worth sitting with honestly before this story gets written into sports history as an obvious masterstroke. Caitlyn Clark's power was never purely geographic. It was personal. It was built on an identity rooted in authenticity, in the specific credibility of someone who came from somewhere unassuming and performed at a level that made the assumption of modesty feel inadequate. That identity traveled to Indiana and made a mid-sized Midwest market feel like the center of the sporting world for an extended and remarkable period of time. Whether it travels to Los Angeles with the same force, whether it resonates inside a city whose relationship with authenticity is considerably more complicated, is genuinely unknown. What is not unknown is what she proved in Indiana. She proved that the right player does not need the right market. She proved that the market finds her. And that proof, regardless of what comes next, belongs permanently to the chapter that is now closing. If this story stayed with you longer than most, a like tells us it was worth building. We are already working on the next one, and it is a story that goes even deeper than this. Stay close.